Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, the multi-billion-dollar European Peace Fund. Europe says it's to fight terrorism in Africa and counter China and Russia. Activists say it'll provide arms and training to dictators. When central banks finance government spending, are they still independent? We'll tell you how much central banks make and the debts they own. And where to blame for the climate emergency. Extreme weather events will continue to worsen, costing billions and displacing millions. The European Union has long used its economic power to spread influence around the world. Efforts to create a European defence force have largely been a failure. Brussels has traditionally relied on NATO for military action, but the United States has been increasing pressure on the European Union to do more for its own security. In comparison with world powers, Europe's defence spending has been far behind, although Europe's biggest and second biggest economy, Germany and France, rank 7 and 8 out of the top 10 spenders. So 14 European countries this year proposed a rapid response force to help democratic foreign governments needing urgent help. In 2007, the EU set up battle groups of 1,500 personnel to respond to crises, but they've never actually been used. It also established a €7.9 billion European Defence Fund to finance the next generation of warplanes, tanks and ships. The money will only be available to European defence companies, and Washington has already raised competition concerns. However, there is a little-known fund that has gone under the radar, the €5 billion European Peace Facility. It'll provide training and equipment, including for the first time, weapons to non-European military forces around the world. Well, the prospect of Europe giving arms to dictators or undemocratic forces, especially in the Sahel in northwest Africa, is raising concerns. France is in the process of withdrawing its troops from the region after 8 years fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS-aligned forces. France's intervention hasn't reduced the violence, though, and it's only been able to continue operating in the Sahel with the support of US satellite and drone intelligence, strategic airlift, and air-to-air refueling. The Sahel is seen as an important battleground for the European Union, primarily to stop migration across the Mediterranean, but also to counter the presence of China and Russia on the continent. Right, let's get some analysis now with Volker Hauck. He's head of the Security and Resilience Programme at the European Centre for Development Policy Management. Joins us now via Skype from Maastricht in the Netherlands. Good to have you with us. So the European Peace Facility, it isn't entirely new, is it? Why is it attracting a lot of attention now?
Well, it is a new instrument, but it is not entirely new because there are certain elements of the instrument which have been implemented before. It is an instrument that builds on the former African Peace Facility, which provided support on peace and security via the African Union since 2007, and it ends this year. Now, the new thing about the European Peace Facility is that it is a global facility, also underlying the wider ambitions of the EU to engage globally on peace and security matters. Second, it is, and this is really the big change, and it is a paradigm shift for the EU, that it is there to provide also lethal weapons to countries the EU is partnering with. Now, the third element is that the EU can directly interact with individual states. Before, under the African Peace Facility for African states, everything had to be clearly communicated, negotiated, also agreed upon with the African Union. Now, this consultation is not excluded currently, but the final decision on the use of the European Peace Facility funds is with Brussels or with the EU.
Right.
One should, however, put this into perspective, if I just may add this. It is a fund that has €5 billion in total over a period of 7 years. Now, if you break this down and if you see what commitments there are already, some 2 to 2.5 billion will go into the African Union support of AMISOM for Somalia, the African Union Peace Support Operation. Now, this remains, this leaves some 300 to 400 billion euro to support globally peace and security. Just to give you a figure, Nigeria spent between 2017 and 2019 annually 1.7 billion. So here you have the proportions, but it is money to buy material, military material.
Okay, and if we pick up on the second point you mentioned there in the three you were listing, using public money to basically supply weapons to foreign militaries, do you think that's the best way to promote peace in the world?
Well, you are right to put a question mark there, but it reflects in a way also a changing thinking within European member states and the EU, because there is a feeling that the EU needs to find its position also internationally, that there have been experiences, certainly as of the 2010s with Syria, with Libya, that the environment of the EU is getting more and more insecure, and the EU, this is the rationale, wants to become more of an international actor. Now, the theory behind this is fairly simple. There is an idea of supplying weapons to military actors so that they can take care of the security, and that this will help to stabilize a context.
But if I could jump in here, that theory
yes.
kind of, I guess you could argue, has been tested in some areas, despite foreign forces, despite a UN peacekeeping mission in Mali, in Niger, and Burkina Faso. We've seen some kind of bolstering even of local military forces there. And yet over the past year, violence has gone up, not down. I mean, is this theory really working? Are fundamental challenges really being addressed?
Well, it is a fairly simple theory of change, though the EU has never said we will supply military material and then peace and security will happen. The concept is to work through an integrated or comprehensive approach, that weapons are one part of the cooperation, the other part is related to peace building, it's related to humanitarian assistance, development, political support for electoral processes, etc. And there is the expectation that over time this will result in stability and peace. Now, Afghanistan shows that this theory of change is really very simplistic and does not work. However, one also needs to recognize that in certain contexts, like Liberia, also Sierra Leone, the approach has helped to stabilize. Now, this was not through the EU. There were the UK was very present in this regard, provided also military support to forces. But the example of Afghanistan now clearly shows that this theory is unlikely to work for a big country like Mali, with huge areas that can not be controlled, where also non-state armed actors, extremist groups have enough space to hide.
So when I'm glad you made that comparison. So when you look at some areas where this theory, if we can call it, has worked somewhat, to other places like Afghanistan, as you mentioned, where it hasn't, what has been the key difference? How will this facility succeed where foreign forces have failed in other areas like Afghanistan?
Well, there is an argument that the EU has provided, EU member states as well as EU missions have provided training support to military actors, to soldiers. These soldiers have then no lethal material to also operate. So the situation has occurred that these actors were trained, but were unable to act upon what they had been trained with. Now, this then means that the countries try to take over more ownership of their security situation and allow also the EU to withdraw with the troops. So this is part of the concept. And as I said, it has not worked in the case of Afghanistan. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, with very different contexts, are unlikely to get stabilized, similar to what has happened in Liberia or Sierra Leone, for example, because the vastness of the area, as mentioned, allows these non-state to hide. Yes.
I've got to ask this question. We've got to look at it from this perspective. How much of this has to do as well with countering China and Russia?
There is a geopolitical dimension to it, that's right. As mentioned earlier, the EU tries to find its place, tries also to become more of a global actor. But the instrument as such has no potential to counter whatever influences from China or Russia, or to fill in the US, which has basically had no policy for Africa under the Trump administration. So
is it also a little bit about maybe making up for the perception that America is no longer a reliable partner for Europe? Is that part of this?
Well, yeah, this plays into it clearly, and that the EU is also aware, the EU member states, one needs to underline here, are aware that more needs to be done by Europe, and that more responsibility needs to be taken. So this clearly plays into this, but as I said, the amount of resources which have been allocated to the European Peace Facility are rather minimal. However, it opens a door for potentially more support in the future after the current 7-year budget cycle of the EU is over, and thereby also opening more potential for more military support in the future. So as mentioned at the very beginning, it's a paradigm shift. Mm-hmm. And this is really in relation also to a changing world order, and also the EU trying to beef up, to become more vocal, to be more active internationally, trying to find its place.
All right, Volker, thanks very much for analyzing this paradigm shift. It's been good talking to you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
The UN says there's no longer any doubt human activity is warming the planet, and some of that impact is irreversible. Greece, Turkey, much of the western US all experienced some of their worst wildfires in history. Extreme weather events will continue to worsen, costing billions and displacing millions. Our environment editor, Nick Clark, has more from Manavgat in Turkey, where wildfires have caused widespread destruction.
It is an apocalyptic scene. Skeletal trees with their fruit charred as they hang. No one has ever seen fires like these before. They came with little warning, leaving people stunned, with everything lost. Even the dead weren't spared from the flames. Home and hearth fit now only for demolition. These are the consequences of an overheated world. A children's playground melted by the intense heat. Those who played here may well wonder what the future holds in this changing world. This will be the future, say the scientists, unless something is done. And this, they say, is just a hint of what could be to come. Humanity has lit the fuse, and humanity must put it out before it's too late. I talked to 65-year-old farmer Bilal Okudan. He tells me the only clothes he has left are the ones he's standing in.
We lost everything. There is nothing left of our house. It's the same for our neighbors. Zero. The tractor, the hoe, the shovel, every tool we had is gone. Everything we built up in 70 to 80 years is gone. All of it disappeared in 20 minutes. It came and went like a sea wave.
From Turkey to Greece, it's been a furious fight against the fires. Extraordinary temperatures sparking the tragedy. In all these regions, wildfires happen every year, but never on this scale. It's the same in Northern California, where fires are blazing over hundreds of square kilometers, destroying communities. Across the world, extreme weather is building in ferocity. Just last month, unprecedented floods in Germany and Belgium devastated towns and swept away roads. More than 200 were killed, with many still missing. And the science shows it's fossil fuel emissions that have made these events worse. Man-made climate change. The truth is, this is a story that people don't really want to hear. The reality perhaps too much for people to deal with, to take in. But what's becoming increasingly clear is that the consequences of doing nothing at all is infinitely worse for everybody. Özcan Dogan has been helping with the rescue effort here in southern Turkey. He says the fires were sparked after months of drought, followed by an intense heat wave.
Antalya is famous for its long-lasting rains. And these last years, there is no rains. In this year, in March, in April and in May, there was clearly no sign of rain. And this is the result.
And then, just like that, as we're heading back from filming, this happens. And the sky opens. A deluge of rain cascades down, dousing a parched land. The rain just as unpredictable as the fires, and 2 weeks too late.
Central banks have spent trillions of dollars buying up bonds in a process called quantitative easing. They're trying to make sure the financial system and economy won't completely collapse due to the pandemic. It's born out of the experience and lessons learned from the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008. Well, now central banks acknowledge they're getting close to the point of having to withdraw emergency funding. The last time they attempted to do that, markets went through what came to be known as a taper tantrum. That was back in 2013. Many critics said investors had become hooked on cheap money, and most of that had gone into inflating stock markets and house prices. Well, that process also increases inequality. Well, right now, there are concerns that if central banks don't withdraw funding, it could drive up inflation. And despite central banks claiming to be independent, some, like the Bank of England, have been accused of funding government deficits. By the end of 2021, the bank will own £875 billion of government bonds, or 40% of national debt. Now, for all the debt central banks own and for printing currency, they earn money. The Bank of England handed almost $700 million to the government each year. That's nothing compared to the Bank of Japan, though, which made a profit of $11 billion on its holding of government debt and stocks. It owns 45% of the government's $13 trillion debt mountain. The Federal Reserve sent $88.5 billion in profits to the US Treasury in 2020. The Fed's balance sheet, which includes government debt, doubled since 2019 to $8.2 trillion. Switzerland's central bank made more than $47 billion in the first 6 months of the year, as soaring US equity prices pushed its reserves to more than 1 trillion Swiss francs. Well, those oversized profits are all due to the unconventional practices central banks have adopted since the financial crisis. So let's dive into this with financial markets analyst Kaia Parv. She joins us now live from London via Skype. Good to have you with us, Kaia. So the Bank of England would deny it was financing Britain's deficit. Does that really matter?
Thank you for having me, first and foremost. So monetary and fiscal policies have indeed become joined at the hip. And looking at the numbers, we can see that the BOE has absorbed most of the issuance by the government. Does this matter? I think yes, because central banks by nature are indiscriminate buyers. They don't really look at the creditworthiness of the issuer, nor at the yields. And I think it will become even more important once the central banks start winding down their easing policies, because there's just not enough buyers on the market.
Well, central banks have been printing money without fear, you could say, of fear of inflation for a while. What's changing now?
I think the biggest change with this crisis is really the supply side distortions that we have not seen before. We have seen dislocations in the economy, and as mentioned, distortion in the supply chains, especially in Asia and in Southeast Asia. What has changed now is that these supply chain disruptions are very hard to control. Moreover, we are seeing an emergence of Delta variant and the subsequent lockdowns in manufacturing hub of Southeast Asia. And I think this is something central banks really have no control over.
So where do you think that's going to lead the world and central banks?
It's hard to say. I think the central banks perhaps have painted themselves in the corner. They are, seems to me, just playing by the ear, seeing what's going to happen. And this is also evident from the Fed's policy of sort of being behind the curve when it comes to inflation management. My fear is, however, that perhaps being behind the curve isn't the best policy, because once inflation expectations are heightened, it's very hard to say change consumer behaviors, because consumers always adjust their behavior and it tends to be quite sticky for a long time.
I'm glad you mentioned the Fed there. The Fed chair is saying, hey, inflation is transitory. Do you agree with him?
It seemed transitory at first, especially with the supply chain disruptions, because these seem to be short-lived. But now when we see Southeast Asia and a lot of other Asian countries, such as China, in a lockdown again, I think the disruptions could last a bit longer. And moreover, the more sticky inflation coming from the rentals is also a bit murky, especially with the moratorium of eviction now being hotly debated and sort of extended in a way. So it's hard to say if it's going to be transitory. I think we are yet to see. But what's certain is that with any additional lockdown, consumer behavior is definitely going to change. And we are seeing this, for instance, with the savings rate that's still above the pre-pandemic levels.
Or could it be that inflation is more nuanced, the effect of spending being shifted away from services during the pandemic and lockdown to now buying computers and home offices, etc.?
For sure. During the lockdown, we saw a lot of pent-up demand when it came to durables, when people had a lot of time and money at hand. But I think that's now in the rearview window. We are seeing now increased demand for services with the reopening and sort of being in the summer season. But what's important to note is that the services industry, especially those cyclical and reopening related services, are tiny compared to the durables.
All right, we're already seeing interest rates rise from Turkey to Brazil. When do you think that's going to catch on to the big four?
Looking at market rates, 2023 seems to be the likely year. However, as mentioned before, we are seeing new variants emerging across the globe. Delta is now the dominant strain across major economies. So it's really hard to say where we're going to end up, let's say, in the second half of 2021 and in 2022.
Perhaps related to that, we've seen China's export growth unexpectedly slow in July, haven't we? While imports also losing a bit of momentum. Do you think that points to a slowdown for the global economy?
Indeed, seems so. We are seeing lockdowns in Asia. We are seeing the economy slowing down in Europe, in the US. I think the second half of the year definitely is going to be more volatile. And I think the investors should be prepared for perhaps a correction in the markets, stronger USD and likely lower yields.
And with China's regulatory crackdown on companies, do you think that's going to send money towards Western stocks?
You would hope so. So Chinese government is taking very aggressive steps towards regulating different industries, whether it's from anti-corruption to data privacy perspective. The timing is very interesting because it seems to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the CCP. But I think the Chinese government is willing to take short-term pain for the long-term gain. But the investors really need to be mindful of this increased regulatory risk. Or rather, I should say the regulatory risk has been brought to the foreground and it just has to be factored in. But I think in general, China, as well as emerging Asia, has become less investable.
Now, with the US infrastructure bill slowly becoming a reality, it seems Washington is moving back to its regular sort of debt ceiling fight. Are investors prepared for this?
It really doesn't seem so. It doesn't seem like investors are looking at the debt ceiling at all at this point. And the Democrats are also taking quite bold steps here, not adding this very sensitive topic into the budget reconciliation process. I think they are hoping that perhaps there will be some sort of bipartisan solution. But with the Democrats trying to pass $3.5 trillion worth of anti-poverty bill using partisan lines, I don't think the Republicans have much incentives to sort of play along. So again, I think it's going to be volatile September, especially the 30th of September deadline. and investors ought to be prepared, perhaps putting some dry powder on the side, or perhaps decreasing their exposure to US equities.
All right, wonderful. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.